You're watching a Highwire Media podcast. Welcome to the True Crime Never Sleeps show. I'm your host, Larry Ellis. We're back for a delayed episode of Murder Monday. And this week, we dive into Denise Amber Lee. The way we live has changed so much in the last 25 years. There's probably no other point in history where the human experience has evolved so rapidly over such a short period of time. Do you ever think about that? Regardless of where you stand on how technological progress has affected life in the 21st century, one thing I think everyone can agree on is that a positive byproduct of all this advancement is that getting a lot harder to kidnap someone and get away with it. There are cameras everywhere now. We all carry mobile devices with GPS tracking our movements. Even our cars have GPS. If we see something, we can say something instantaneously, so long as we have at least one bar of cell signal. Today's story takes place in 2008, and it concerns an abduction, one that, had it happened 50 years earlier, may have remained a mystery forever. This abduction was witnessed by multiple people, resulting in a flood of calls to 911 as it was still happening. It became a race against time to rescue the victim. Denise and Nate Lee loved telling the story of how they met. They were both still in high school when, during her senior year, Denise finally worked up the nerve to ask out her crush, Nate. He hung around the cool kids and the jocks, existing in a completely different world from Denise. After their first date, they just knew. They knew they were meant for each other. Even though they had only just met, they were already falling in love. Valentine's Day was approaching, so Nate went out and bought Denise a ring. It wasn't an engagement ring, just a simple heart-shaped ring that cost $40. Token of his affection. The next ring he would buy her, though, would be an engagement ring. After they got married, whenever Denise would tell the story, she'd proudly show off that heart-shaped ring, saying she had never taken it off since that special Valentine's Day. They were still only in their late teens when they got married in 2005, just a year after they met. It was a beautiful marriage. They were young, but they were mature and well-adjusted, making them great partners to each other. They were also close with one another's families. Long into their marriage, they welcomed their first child, Noah. Then in 2007, their second son, Adam. This was a lot for Denise, who soon realized she couldn't juggle both college and being a mother. She withdrew from school to focus full-time on her family. Her degree would have to wait. Since she also couldn't work while raising two children, Nate had to take on 3 jobs to make ends meet. His main job was a meter reader for the power company, but he also worked part-time stocking shelves at the Winn-Dixie supermarket. During the summer, he was a Little League umpire. Nate was constantly working. They found a house to rent in Northport, Florida, one county over from where they had both grown up, near Sarasota. The house was way out in the sticks, right on the edge of civilization. Beyond the development was swampy land, which made Denise's parents a little uneasy. But the rent was dirt cheap for a newly constructed 3-bedroom, 2-bath home, making it an affordable option for their growing family. It also helped them save up for their ultimate goal, buying a home on their own. On the morning of January 17, 2008, it was drizzling and still dark outside when Nate left for work. Denise stayed home as she did every day with her 2 boys, who at this point were 2 years old and 6 months old. She was somewhat shy, and now with 2 kids, she rarely went out unless she was with her husband or children. Her entire world revolved around her family. That morning, she took Noah out onto the back porch and gave him a haircut. Around 11 a.m., Nate called to check in, as he often did during his workday. They talked for about 5 minutes. Nate reminded her to open the windows because it was a cool, breezy January day, and they could save money by turning off the AC. But Denise was already ahead of him. The windows were open. They said "I love you" to each other and went on with their day. Nate got busy at work and wasn't able to call again until 3 p.m. after his shift ended, and when he did, the phone just rang. And that was unusual. He tried again, but still no answers. As he got into his car to drive home, his concern grew. Denise always answered his calls. The drive home took about half an hour, and Nate called the house 7 more times along the way. Each time, the phone rang with no response. By the time he pulled in the driveway, he was panicked. The doors were all locked. When he walked inside, everything I should say, was eerily quiet. He called out for Denise. There was no reply. Her keys, purse, and cell phone were still inside. He checked the porch, the backyard, around the house, nothing. Denise was nowhere to be found. Both of their sons were still there, in their crib together, completely unharmed, but Denise was gone. This was not like her. She never ever left the children alone. This was something she simply would not do. Her clothes were laid out as if she had been able to take a shower but had been interrupted. And the windows she had opened that morning were now closed, but not latched. It looked as if someone had hurriedly pushed them down. The air conditioning was off, making the house hot and stuffy. Now Nate was really freaking out. He had no idea what was going on. He called Denise's mother. She hadn't heard from her either. His next call was to 911. Nate called 911 and reported that he had just returned home from work to find his wife missing. The information was transmitted to the Northport Police Department. After hanging up with 911, Nate immediately called Denise's father, Sergeant Rick Goff, a 25-year veteran of the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office. First, Sergeant Goff didn't comprehend what Nate was saying. Earlier that afternoon, he had called the house to invite Denise and Nate over for dinner, but no one answered, so he left a message. Now, when he picked up Nate's call, he casually asked, "Hey, you guys want to come over and eat?" Nate told him they couldn't. Denise was missing. Sergeant Goff was confused. "What do you mean, missing?" "I'm telling you," Nate said, "she's missing." He explains that he had arrived home from work to find the house locked. Denise's belongings still inside, the kids alone in their crib, and Denise nowhere to be found. When he got off the phone, Sergeant Goff immediately contacted the Northport Police Department. As a seasoned law enforcement officer, he knew how these situations were often handled. While missing person cases sometimes weren't taken seriously right away. He also expected that they would suspect Nate first, as husbands are often looked at in cases like these. Sergeant Goff knew Nate would never harm his daughter. He didn't want them wasting time investigating the wrong person. He told the Northport PD that his daughter would never just up and leave, that this wasn't a normal case. He believed Denise had been taken. "Get helicopters, get dogs, get on this now." Sergeant Goff didn't stop there. He also called his colleagues at the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office, reached out to a friend, Howie Grace, a photojournalist for the local NBC affiliate, to get the media involved as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Detective Chris Morales of the Northport PD arrived at the Lee residence to begin his investigation. Northport Police weren't just a different agency from the one Sergeant Goff worked for. They were an entirely different jurisdiction. Northport was in Sarasota County, while Sergeant Goff worked in Charlotte County. Inside the house, Detective Morales found no signs of forced entry or struggle. The couple's two young sons were safe. By this point, Denise's father and Nate's parents had also arrived, and a police helicopter was already circling the area, searching for Denise. Despite this, the police were clearly considering Nate a suspect. They started asking him questions about his marriage, whether he and Denise argued, how often they fought. This was frustrating for everyone. Nate's parents, Denise's parents, because they all knew Nate would never do anything to hurt Denise, and time was slipping away. Then the police canvassed the neighborhood, and that's when they got a lead. Lee's next door neighbor told investigators that sometime between 1 and 2 p.m. they had been watching TV when they happened to glance outside and noticed a suspicious car slowly creeping up and down the road. It was a green Chevy Camaro. The neighbor watched as the car circled the block 4 or 5 times, moving suspiciously slow. This made them uneasy. They decided to step outside for a closer look, thinking maybe the driver was lost. They made eye contact with the man behind the wheel, then the man pulled into the Lee's driveway. At that point, the neighbor assumed he must have been a friend of Denise or Nate and went back inside. 15 minutes later, they went outside again to check the mail and noticed the same green Camaro pulling out of the Lee's driveway before driving away. Once the police got that information, it became clear. Denise Lee had been likely abducted by whoever was driving that Camaro. By now, it was 5 p.m. and the sun was starting to set. The Northport Police Department drafted a BOLO, or Be on the Lookout Bulletin, forwarded it to surrounding law enforcement agencies, including the Florida Highway Patrol, U.S. Marshals, and neighboring police departments. This included the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office where Denise's father worked. But here's where the things take a devastating turn. Charlotte County had sent their teletype operator home for the day to save money on overtime. This meant that the BOLO alert went completely unnoticed by the department for 2 whole hours, and these were critical hours as night was quickly approaching. While this delay was happening, at around 5:30 p.m., a man named Harold Muxlow received an unexpected visit from his cousin Michael King. Michael told Harold that he needed to borrow a few things: a gas can, a flashlight, and a shovel. He claimed his lawnmower was stuck in his yard. Now that might sound odd. Why would someone need a flashlight or a shovel to get a lawnmower unstuck? Harold didn't question it at first. He went into his garage, gathered the items, and handed them to Michael. Michael took them, thanked him, and walked back to his car. As Harold turned to head back into his house, he suddenly heard a woman's voice scream from inside the vehicle. "Call the cops," the voice cried out. Harold froze. He turned back toward the car and saw Michael frantically fumbling with something in the back seat. Harold walked toward him. "What's going on? What was that?" Michael looked up, said, "Nothing, don't worry about it." Harold hesitated, but started walking back towards his house. Something didn't sit right with him. He turned around again, and this time he saw Michael hunched over the center console, pressing down on the head of a woman who was struggling in the back seat. He saw a knee rise up, pushing against Michael as if the woman was trying to fight him off. Then, without another word, Michael got in the driver's seat and sped off. Harold was rattled. That was not normal, and that was not right. So Harold decided to drive to Michael's house to check out his story. If his lawnmower really was stuck in his yard, then maybe there was some explanation for what he had just seen. But when he got there was no lawnmower, no sign of anything being stuck. And Michael wasn't home. Now Harold knew something was seriously wrong. He told his daughter Sabrina what had happened, and Sabrina did what he should have done. She called 911. Meanwhile, at 6:14 p.m., another 911 call came into the Sarasota County Emergency Center. This time, it was from a woman, crying and terrified. "I'm so sorry, I just want to go home," she said. It was Denise. Her voice was full of fear. "I just want to see my family again. Please, please let me go." In the background, a man's voice could be heard, angry, demanding, "Where's my effing phone?" Denise sobbing, "I don't know where your phone is. I'm sorry. Are you being honest with me?" the man snapped. "I don't have your phone," she pleaded. Then she asked him a question, one that must have made her heart stop. "Are you going to hurt me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he barked, "Give me the phone." Denise cried out, "Help me." And then, the call abruptly ended. Her father, Sergeant Rick Goff, listened to that 911 call. He knew his daughter was alive, but she was running out of time. Denise was alive, but she was in serious danger. Her father knew time was slipping away. She had managed to call 911 despite being restrained in the back seat of her abductor's vehicle. He was trying to communicate in a way that wouldn't alert the man to what she was doing, while she's still letting the operator know she needed help. While authorities were scrambling, another 911 call came in. This time, it was from Sabrina, Harold's daughter. She told the dispatcher what her father had seen, how his cousin Michael King had come by asking for a gas can, a flashlight, and a shovel, and how a woman had screamed for help from inside his car. The dispatcher responded immediately, saying they had been looking for a missing woman. There was already a helicopter in the area, and Sabrina was told she had done the right thing by calling, even though the suspect was her father's cousin. Sabrina provided the address of both her father's house and Michael King's house. Michael's home was only 4 miles away from Denise's. This meant that Denise was still in the area, still alive. By now, a massive search effort was underway. What are the chances in a missing persons case that you have multiple 911 calls giving real-time information about the victim's whereabouts? That you already know who the abductor is, that you already have his name, his vehicle description, and his home address. And yet, Michael King was still out there, and Denise had still not been found. Then at 6:30 p.m., another call, the fourth 911 call about Denise that day. This one came from a motorist named Jane Kowalski. Unlike the previous calls, this one was routed to Charlotte County's 911 call center. Jane was driving when she pulled up to a red light. As she sat there, she heard something coming from the car next to her, a green Camaro. The screaming was unlike anything she had ever heard before, terrified and desperate. Jane glanced over at the driver, a man. He turned around and pushed down on something or someone in the back seat. Then, Jane saw it, a hand rising up from behind the driver's seat, banging on the passenger side window. Jane's heart raced. She thought it was a child, someone between 5 and 10 years old being abducted. She immediately called 911. Dispatcher asked Jane where she was. He gave her a location, explaining that she was still sitting at the red light. She waited, hoping the Camaro would move forward so she could get the license plate, but it didn't. The driver just sat there, not moving, as if he knew she was watching him. Finally, the light turned green. Jane rolled forward slowly, hoping the Camaro would pass her so she could see the plate. Instead, the driver changed lanes and pulled behind her. Now Jane was nervous. She drove slowly. The Camaro slowed down even more, lagging behind her. The driver was trying to avoid her, trying to make sure she couldn't get his plate. Then, just as Jane was trying to figure out what to do, the Camaro suddenly changed lanes and made a left turn on Toledo Blade Boulevard, heading toward I-75. Jane wanted to follow him, but there was too much traffic. She couldn't switch lanes in time, and just like that, the Camaro was gone. But she was still on the phone with 911. The call lasted 9 minutes. And here's the heartbreaking part. There were 4 patrol cars within 1 mile of Jane at the time, and none of them were dispatched. Why? Because when the Charlotte County's 911 operator, Mildred Stepp, took Jane's call, she was so excited that instead of immediately logging the information into the system, she stood up from her cubicle and called out to the dispatchers, "It's about that vehicle alert that we're looking for." But no one logged it. No one sent it out to patrol. By the time Mildred finally entered the call into the system at 6:42 p.m., 12 minutes after answering Jane's call, it was too late. 4 minutes later, at 6:45 p.m., there was a shift change at the dispatch center. The information got lost in the shuffle. No officers were ever sent to look for the Camaro. The Northport Police Department wouldn't even find out about Jane Kowalski's call until the next day. In just 15 minutes, 3 separate 911 calls had come in about Denise. One of them was from Denise herself. And yet, despite multiple agencies, helicopters, ATVs, and officers searching for her, despite knowing the abductor's name, car, and home address, Michael King was still out there. Denise was still missing. 2 hours passed. Finally, at around 9 p.m., 2 officers, Charlotte County Sheriff's Deputy Christian Weimer and Florida State Trooper Edward Pope, were stationed near Toledo Blade Boulevard, where the green Camaro had been seen. They had received the bullet alert by this point. They knew the car, they knew the suspect, they knew the victim. And at 9:10 p.m., they saw it. A green Camaro pulling on the I-75 from Toledo Blade Boulevard. They began following it. Eventually, Trooper Pope activated his lights and pulled the car over. He positioned himself behind his cruiser door, drew his gun, and ordered the driver to exit the vehicle. The driver didn't move. Trooper Pope shouted the command again. Still nothing. He warned the driver that if he didn't comply, he would open fire. Finally, the door swung up. Out stepped Michael King. He was wearing a camouflage shirt and jeans. His arms were raised in surrender. His jeans were soaked from the waist down. His shoes were caked in mud. Trooper Pope immediately handcuffed him. Then, he looked into the car. Denise wasn't there. This was not a good sign. On the rear spoiler of the Camaro, Trooper Pope noticed what looked like blood spatter. Inside the car, he found a cell phone, its battery, and the SIM card removed. In the back seat, there was a blanket, a dirt-covered shovel, and a heart-shaped ring, Denise's ring. The ring Nate had given her when they first started dating, the ring she never took off. Back at the station, Michael refused to talk. Over the next day, search teams scoured the area near where he had been pulled over. Then, near Plantation Boulevard in Northport, one of the searchers noticed something. A patch of dirt that looked like it had been recently disturbed. Nearby, small piles of sand, out of place. They looked closer. There was blood. By morning, a forensic team arrived to begin excavating the site. 3 inches below the surface, they found her, Denise, lying on her side, curled into a fetal position, a single gunshot wound to her head. She had fought so hard, she had done everything right, she had called for help. Help had been so close, but in the end, it wasn't enough. Denise had been found, but it was far too late. She had fought so hard, she had done everything right. She had gotten a hold of her abductor's phone and called 911. She had left behind evidence. She had been seen by multiple people. 5 calls had been made to emergency services that day, pinpointing her location, her abductor, even his name. And yet, he was gone. The autopsy revealed that Denise had been shot in the forehead, just above her left eyebrow. The gun had been pressed directly against her skin when it was fired, causing catastrophic damage. Her left eye had essentially exploded from impact. She had not died immediately. Blood was found in her lungs, which meant she had still been breathing after she was shot. She had aspirated on her own blood before she finally succumbed to her injuries. A few days later, a 9mm shell casing was found in the grass near where her body had been buried. The gun itself was never recovered, but investigators learned that just hours before Denise had been reported missing, Michael King had visited a shooting range with a friend. That friend confirmed that King had a 9mm firearm in his possession. It was clear. Michael King had seen Denise alone at home, through the same open windows that Nate had reminded her about that morning. Entered those windows, abducted her, bound her wrists with duct tape, and taken her back to his house. There, he raped her. Then, with her still tied up, he put her back in his car. He stopped at his cousin's Harold's house, borrowing a flashlight, shovel, and a gas can, tools he knew he would need. Denise had screamed for help right there, right in front of Harold. Michael had driven through traffic with her in the car, past other people through multiple counties. He had seen Jane Kowalski notice him. He had seen her watching him as Denise banged on the window for help. Then he had driven her to a remote construction site, put the gun against her head, pulled the trigger, and buried her. Denise's DNA was found in both King's home and in his car. His semen was found on her underwear. The duct tape he used to restrain her had both his semen and her blood on it. The case against him was airtight. Still, he pled not guilty. His defense, he claimed that he even kidnapped. That he and Denise had both been taken and tied up together. It was absurd. There was no evidence to support it. His trial began in 2009. His attorneys argued that King had suffered brain damage as a child in a sledding accident. They claimed he had a divot in his brain and an IQ of 71. His family members testified that he was never the same after his injury, but it didn't matter. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Witness after witness testified against him. His cousin Harold took the stand, so did Jane, the woman who had been stopped at the traffic light when she saw Denise banging on the car window. Another witness, a second motorist, who had also heard Denise screaming from the Camaro at a different intersection, came forward. He admitted that he hadn't called 911 at the time, and that he deeply regretted it. The jury deliberated and found Michael King guilty of first-degree murder, sexual battery, and kidnapping. On August 28, 2009, they recommended the death penalty by unanimous vote, 12-0. On December 4th of that year, the judge followed the jury's recommendation. Michael King was sentenced to death by lethal injection. In 2016, he filed an appeal, but the sentence was upheld. Denise's murder was horrifying, but what made it even more tragic was how many opportunities there had been to stop it. So many moments where the system should have worked, but it didn't. 5 calls to 911, patrol cars right there within a mile of her, never dispatched. Bolo alert that wasn't seen for 2 hours because the operator had been sent home early. A dispatcher who stood up from her desk instead of entering information into the system. If any of these failures hadn't happened, Denise might have been saved. Nate Lee, Denise's widower, was devastated, but he was also angry. He sued the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office for their mishandling of the case, and in 2012, he was awarded a $1.25 million settlement. But he didn't stop there. He turned his grief into action. Nate created the Denise Amber Lee Foundation, dedicated to improving 911 emergency response systems around the country. The foundation advocates for better training, stricter procedures, and accountability in emergency dispatch. Because of Denise's case, changes were made in Florida. In 2008, just 4 months after her murder, the Florida legislature passed the Denise Amber Lee Act, requiring all 911 operators in the state to undergo a minimum of 232 hours of training. Denise's father also became involved in advocacy efforts, speaking publicly about the failures that cost his daughter her life. As for Nate, he eventually found love again. He remarried, bought a home in Goldwood, Florida, and continued raising his 2 sons, Noah and Adam. Denise's absence is still felt. She should have been there to see her boys grow up. She should have survived. This should have been a survivor story, but instead it was a preventable tragedy. Denise did everything right. The system failed her, so today, take a moment to remember Denise Amber Lee, to think about her husband Nate, her 2 sons Noah and Adam, her parents Rick and Sue, and let's keep her entire family in our thoughts. Because Denise's story should have had a different ending, but her legacy lives on. The Denise Amber Lee Foundation continues to fight for better emergency response systems so that no one else has to suffer the way she did, so that no other family has to endure this kind of loss. Just so that when someone does everything right, the system will work the way it's supposed to. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. What did you think about this case? And of course, give us a thumbs up if you like our video. Hit the subscribe button down below. Hit the bell notification button to be notified of future videos. And with that, I'd like to thank you so much for watching and listening. We will see you next time.